Thank you for inviting me to talk with you all, and thank you especially for showing up on Saturday evening. At least I think it's Saturday evening, since I've been traveling a lot. And it's an honor to be here and to talk to you a little bit about the book. And the book is about a political trial, obviously, Fethullah Gülen. And history has a lot of political trials, of course. We have Socrates back in the time of the Greeks. And we have Jesus, in a political trial. The Inquisition, of course, in Europe. My own country, the Salem trials of the women. But what's interesting about this trial in particular, of course, is that Fethullah Gülen wins. Generally, in a political trial, you lose, and usually lose your life, or at least end up in prison for quite a while. But this trial was very interesting, not only because Fethullah Gülen wins the trial, but because it also plays into the process of democratization in Turkey. Fethullah Gülen, in a sense, wins because of the increasing democracy in Turkey, but also vice versa, the trial helps strengthen democracy in Turkey. So I'm sure it was a very painful process for him. The trial went on 8 years altogether. And as I said, at the end, he won. I want to make one thing clear in some of the comments that I'm going to make about Turkey, about the legal system in Turkey. Some of the comments will be critical. And I'm not an American exceptionalist. I don't believe that our country has necessarily the best legal system. In fact, as you've heard, I've done civil rights work, human rights work for 40 years, so I have a pretty good idea of how the problems with my own country. But the criticisms I'm going to make, that I do make, are in terms of the larger context of what went on in Turkey and the changes that happened. There have been a great amount of changes, amazing amount of changes in the last 20 years or so. So anyway, there are 5 parts to this. Number 1, why prosecute Fethullah Gülen? Why take him to court? This is a man, after all, that Monsignor Marovic, who was the representative of the Pope in Istanbul, called a saint. What was the charge against him? 3, who was the opposition? 4, who were the actors? And 5, what was the wild card? I don't know if wild card means something in Austria, but when you're playing cards, I know this is true in Turkey, when you're playing cards, there is a card that's called the wild card, and it counts for anything, and it gives you the benefit of the game. Usually win if you have a wild card. So there's a wild card here that we'll talk about at some point that changes the whole dynamic of the prosecution. So anyway, why prosecute Fethullah Gülen? And the prosecution not only was of him, but of the movement, anything associated with the movement. And as most of you know, Fethullah Gülen comes out of the moderate Sufi tradition in Turkey. And he studied the path of nursing, and went on to his own. And part of this tradition is to respect science and religion, that they can coexist. In fact, that they complement each other, that they're not in opposition to each other. And it's also what we would call an ecumenical movement, in that the tradition doesn't say that this is the only true religion for everybody, but that everybody works together. Everybody works together in this tradition, or as the Sufis would say, good people doing good things. That's the important part about it. In the movement that is inspired by Fethullah Gülen, refers to itself as a civil society movement. A civil society movement to change society, to improve society, to help people, to strengthen institutions of civil society, democracy. Even though people in the movement are religiously motivated, the movement is not a religious movement. It doesn't try to convert people. It tries to work with people to strengthen and build society. And it's called, generally it's called Hizmet. Hizmet is a term of art in Islam, but it generally, I guess you would translate it as being service, helping people. And the movement is actually supported through the idea of contributing part of your income. In the Bible, we have the idea of tithing, contributing 10–15% of your income to your religious institution or religious church or synagogue or mosque or whatever. But in the Hizmet, the tithing goes into the movement itself, to build schools, to promote dialogue, and generally to do the good work of the movement. And I mentioned schools. Schools are a very important part of the movement. There are over 1,000 schools now around the world, 130 countries. I come from Texas. We have 26 schools in Texas. And we have about 70,000 students on the waiting list that would like to get into the schools because they have that kind of good reputation. The schools got started as part of the movement in Turkey, and they generally focused on poor areas, areas in which there were not state schools. They focused, for example, in the Kurdish area, where there were not state schools. And the benefit of these schools, of course, was to give kids the opportunity to go to college. As you know, in Turkey, you have only a limited number of people that can get into college. I think the last I knew was about 50% of the people who take the test can actually get into college. So providing more schools helped that, in providing schools that help kids get ready. And it was also beneficial to women because this was the only way that women in the Kurdish area could get to school, to get an education. So rather than getting married at 15 and having a bunch of kids early on, is an opportunity for women to get educated. I wanted to show you one picture. I'm not going to show you a lot of slides, but I have one here that, if I can get to it. I'm not very good at this. I don't see it actually, it's not on here. I have a picture of kids in a very poor school in Italia, and the kids, I went and visited the school, and these are very poor kids. The school is very basic. There were fourth and fifth graders, and I said, it was about this size. I said, what do you want to do when you grow up? Right? I have 2 children myself who are teachers, so this is the question you always ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? So one of the kids says, well, I want to be a doctor. Somebody says, I want to be a lawyer. Somebody says, I want to be a policeman. Somebody says, I want to be a business person. The thing that struck me about that is if it wasn't for the school, those kids would not have that dream. They wouldn't be going to school. They would not be dreaming about what they could do in the future. So these schools not only provide that education, but provide that dream that these kids aspire to. What can I do when I get out of college? What can I do in college? What do I want to study? And it changes the whole dynamic, and I think I understood that in a way I had not understood before when I went to the school in Italia. In addition to this education that the Hizmet concentrates on, the foundation, for example, that raises money for catastrophes around the world. It's called Kimsirmu in Turkish, I think, if I pronounced it right. Solidarity and Aid Association. It has provided a good deal of aid whenever there's been a natural catastrophe. You know, there have been floods in Bangladesh, tsunami, Southeast Asia. You can go through the list, earthquakes in Peru, and the earthquake that hit Turkey in Van a year and a half ago. The foundation did a telethon at night on TV and raised $71 million to help the people in Van, the Van area that went through the earthquake that were suffering. So it does that kind of work too. And then another very important part of the Hizmet is dialogue. The trips to Turkey, or this kind of discussion, or dinners, or academic presentations, all that kind of activity that fosters dialogue and communication. When I ended up going to Turkey, I knew nothing about the movement, I knew nothing about Turkey, and I knew nothing about Muslims. I just happened to be in church one Sunday morning, and the judge, who's a friend of mine, says, "Anybody want to go to Turkey?" I said, "Yeah, why not?" But it's dialogue, right? I mean, I've learned a lot in the last 5 years about Turkey, about Muslims, and about the movement through dialogue. And that's what the movement's about. It's not about, or as the Sufis say, souls seeing each other, right? Respecting, seeing God in everybody, and then moving on to make society better. To that kind of activity, so that we strengthen civil society, strengthen the freedom of individuals to develop the way they want to develop, and to strengthen their own practice of goodness. There is criticism of the movement, of course, as you know. One of the criticisms of the movement, of course, is that it's secretly political, and it's really trying to take over the government of Turkey, which is not true, but I mean, that's one of the things that's out there. But the other thing that's more problematic, I think, for me, that took me a long time to understand, is the transparency question. Usually when we talk about organizations, especially in the West, and especially in America, we talk about structure. Who's on the board of directors? Who is the CEO, the chief executive officer? Who is the chief financial officer? What's the corporate relationship between the movement in Chicago and the movement in London? What's the relationship between the movement in Africa and Indonesia? And because we can't see it, well, there is none, right? I mean, that's the problem. The problem when you're trying to see structure. And so what people don't see it, then people think, well, then there's something's being hidden here. There's this lack of transparency. It's not out in the open. It took me a long time to understand that. Being a lawyer, especially, right? I'm always looking for structure. That's the way I was trained. But I think as I got to understand it, I appreciated it better. And also when I get into the trial part of this, there's a legal reason in Turkey not to have a lot of structure also. It's a very important legal reason. So anyway, that's the sort of overview of the movement. And you would think, well, why would you prosecute? Why would you take the person who inspires this movement? Why would you charge him with a crime and put him on trial? Especially, here's part two, especially charge him with being a terrorist. This was what Fethullah Gülen was charged with, being a terrorist, violating the anti-terror law, Article 3713 of Turkish law. What was that about? At the time this happened, you were considered a terrorist if you wanted to change the fundamental nature of the Turkish state. So if you said, as people are now saying, but back then if you said, I don't like the way our parliament's set up, I don't like the way the president's set up, I don't like the way the courts are set up, let's change, let's make our system look like the American system. That would be an act of terrorism, because what you're doing is changing the fundamental nature of the state. And nothing to do with violence. Like today we associate terrorism generally with violence. Nothing to do with violence, nothing to do with committing a crime. It was purely political. And Fethullah Gülen was not the only person prosecuted under the terrorist law. Anybody in opposition to the government was prosecuted. His case happened to take on a different dynamic because he fought it. So, you have this very broad, comprehensive, and vague law that was laid against Fethullah Gülen. And as you know, in Turkey considers itself to be a secular state. But what that means, and this is hard, this took me a long time to understand this too, Secular in Turkey means something different than secular means in the United States, and I think probably different than what it means in Europe. When we talk about secular state in the United States, we mean freedom to practice your religion as long as it doesn't impede upon the public safety, and that the state will have no intervention in religion. The state will not collect money. I think this happens in Europe. Collect money, tax money, give it to churches. In Turkey, secular means the state will govern religion. There's a minister of religion who writes the sermons, right, for the imams, pays the imams, pays for the mosques, so regulates religion, and also prohibits the public exercise of religion in state agencies or colleges. That's where the headscarf controversy comes in, of course, right? Public expression of religion. Last time I came to Europe, I was going through security in Houston. And one of the security guards was wearing a headscarf. And see, in the United States, that happens. It happens all the time because it's not any interference with public safety. But if you were a security guard at the airport in Istanbul, the Ataturk airport, you wouldn't be able to wear the headscarf because that's a public expression of religion, someone who's in public employment. So it's important, I think, this is the hard thing, I think, is this word has different layers of meaning. And when we hear in the United States that Turkey is changing the secular nature of its government, that we think it's, in a bad sense, the way we look at it, instead of actually allowing greater religious expression in Turkey, which is what's going on. So, one of the charges, I'm going to talk more about the other charges against Fethullah Gülen, but one of the charges was that he was making himself the primary Islamic leader, Muslim leader in Turkey. Therefore, he was replacing the minister of religion. Because he's replacing the minister of religion, he was changing the essential nature of the state, right? He was substituting himself. This is the charge, again, for the minister of religion, therefore changing the essential nature of the state. Excuse me, and therefore terrorist. But I'm going to talk more about the charges later on because some of them are really amazing. But who's the opposition, right? Who's the opposition? We talked about who Fethullah Gülen was, what was the charge. Who's the opposition to him? Who are the ones that are engineering the prosecution? In Turkey, of course, what it meant when the movement is educating people, and this is basically in the Anatolia region, was educating people, is raising up a different economic structure. As people get more educated in Anatolia, they begin to say to the people in Istanbul, well, where is our piece of the pie? Because the economy is concentrated in Istanbul. Where's our piece of the pie? Why is all the wealth in Istanbul? Why is it not spread out all through Anatolia? A lot of you probably heard this thing about the black Turks and the white Turks. You know, that goes on. So you have that competition, in a sense. And nobody likes to give up their pie. Right? I mean, it's sometimes hard to understand why millionaires can't live with a little bit less, but they don't. And everybody wants more. So you have that economic tension going on in the country. This is part of the unease. And then you have the military tied in to the economic structure. Right? The military, of course, has done very hard, bloody coups in 60, in 71, and 80. Very bloody coups, as you know, right? The Prime Minister was hanged in the 60 coup. I mean, utterly amazing that you can depose the Prime Minister and then hang him, along with a couple of ministers of the cabinet. And then there was the soft coup, of course, the famous postmodern coup that happened in '97, February 28th. What's important about that is not only is the military there, of course, it has this power, but the military is tied into the economic interests. The military actually has its own foundation that it invests in the economy. And if you've gone around Turkey, of course, you've seen these gated communities that the military live in. They're very nice places of privilege. Their own stores, their own schools, their own buses. Very nice. And you don't want to give that up either. You know, and so the military was very powerful. Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, who was the general here in World War II, became our president. And at the end of 8 years as serving as president, he gave a speech that the greatest danger to American democracy was the military-industrial complex. And he was right, probably, without a doubt. And in fact, some people would say that's why we've been involved in other wars, because of the military-industrial complex. That certainly is the accusation, and why we invaded Iraq. But there's an insight there that I think applies also to Turkey, is that you have this military-industrial complex that thrived, and all of a sudden you have the challenge from Anatolia coming about. Give us some of that. And the military could tell the government, we want this amount of money for us, no questions asked. It was about 40% of the state budget went to the military, without the military even having to submit a detailed budget about how they were going to spend it. That's the kind of economic power that went in to Turkey at this time. And the generals, of course, when they retired, moved over to the board of directors of the media and the banks. So you had a lot of this meshing that went on in the economy. Now, I mentioned the media because that also had a very important role, of course, in engendering the propaganda, if you want to call it that, or the tilt of the media that comes into play when we get around to the charges against Fethullah Gülen. All of this, if you want, you've probably heard, you can roll together into the two big trials that have happened in Turkey recently. Ergenekon and Sledgehammer, all about the deep state, the interplay between all of these interests. And sometimes the interests are against each other, but support each other. And by that I mean, for example, I was in Turkey when this actually happened. There was a Kurdish attack on a military installation, right? And so then the military can say, hey, you know, look what's happening in the Kurdish area, we need more money. Well, it came to light that the military knew the attack was going to happen, but let it happen because they wanted that publicity so they could get more money. So you have unholy alliances like that going on in the deep state. And a lot of that, of course, is surfaced in Ergenekon. A lot of that surfaced in Sledgehammer, where you now have a number of generals in prison because of their plotting against the current government, plotting against organizations. In fact, there was documentation that came out in both cases about plots against the movement, against Fethullah Gülen and the movement. So all of that comes into play. Who are the actors? Who are the actors? I mentioned the press. The press was a very big actor in all of this. The press, as I pointed out, has this economic connection going on. And of course, Fethullah Gülen, or anybody like him, is a threat to the status quo, and the media was there to undercut anybody who opposed the status quo, even as specifically or even in such a nonviolent manner, is still a challenge to the status quo. I mean, look what Gandhi did in India, right, in nonviolence, brought down the British Empire. So it's always a danger. So you have this huge media campaign that begins against Fethullah Gülen right after, a little bit after the 97 soft coup. There's a media campaign. The coup is in February, and the media campaign picks up in June. And some of you might remember the media campaign. Talk to your folks, they'll remember it. I was giving a talk at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and one of the kids came up. And said, you know, my dad was supporting Fethullah Gülen, and all of a sudden this stuff was in the media. He didn't know what to think. And the purpose of the media, of course, was to undercut the movement, was to make people who believed in Fethullah Gülen or in the movement wonder what's going on, right? We have this idea that where there's smoke, there has to be fire. And of course, it was also to poison the movement with regard to people who didn't believe it. And it was a vicious campaign. But the interesting thing about it is, and I talked to the lawyer who started this, when the campaign began, Fethullah Gülen was in Izmir. He was down there as an imam. And I talked to the lawyer, his name was Fethullah, and he was talking to Gülen, and he says, look, you have to fight this. You can't just let the press rag on you all the time. You've got to fight it. And Gülen would say, no, that's not I'm not that way, I don't want to do that. And Fethullah would say, you've got to do it, you've got to do it. And finally, they did it. So every time one of the stuff came up in the press, there would be a lawsuit. And Fethullah Gülen would win. He won more than 200 cases of defamation in the Turkish courts. And I have a website that goes along with the book, and you can look on there and see all the cases, as well as all the legal stuff in the trial. But even though he would win, the press would keep going because in Turkey, there is no consequence. So let's say somebody prints something in the paper, and Gülen sues, and the judge says, you're right, that's defamation. So all the newspaper then has to do is what's called text it. We're wrong. Sorry. And usually you don't put it in the back page on the bottom of the text it. And then the only damages you can collect is if it affected your income, as your wages. And of course, Fethullah Gülen, by this time, doesn't have it. He's on his own. He's no longer paid by the state, so he can't say I've suffered any damages. So in the United States, if you sue for defamation and you win, then the jury decides how much you get. How much does this damage your reputation, all that kind of stuff. It could be $1 million, it could be $500,000, it could be 10,000. But the idea of the law is, in the United States, is it stops the defamation. In Turkey, it doesn't stop it because there's no consequence. You could sell more newspapers by repeating the same thing as they did. Cumhuriyet, for example, would repeat the same thing almost every day. Even though the judge kept saying it's wrong, defamation, you're wrong, print the text it. Sometimes they would not even print the text it because there was no consequence. You would make more money by keeping it going. It's like Fox News. I don't know if in the United States, it's just really awful. But it's sort of like that, just keep doing it. So, but I'll tell you, this comes back later on in the trial, the strategy in the trial, and it's very helpful. And I'll get around to it. So, just kind of keep that in mind. So the press is a big actor here that comes into play. Another actor in this, and this is where I'm going to get some criticism of the Turkish legal system, was the way it was set up. When the Turkish legal system was set up under on the Constitution of the Republic, it was set up in such a way that there was a Supreme Council of judges and prosecutors who would appoint all the judges and all the prosecutors. And so who do they appoint? People that thought like them. So you have the self-perpetuating mechanism. And the judges had enormous power. The Constitutional Court, and this happened once I was in Turkey, could actually throw out a political party. A party that was elected by the people. The Constitutional Court could kick them out of Parliament. Could even ban a party. Amazing power that the Constitutional Court has. And it comes into play all the time. In the United States, for example, our judges are they're federal judges are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They both have to agree. In the states, they're either appointed by the governor or they're elected. In Texas, we elect our judges. So you have democratic input into the judges, into the prosecutors, that you did not have in Turkey. So this is a very clever, when the military wrote this constitution, this is a take it or leave it constitution they wrote in 1982. When they wrote it, I mean, it was very brilliant. So somebody else had to have written it for them, I'm sure, because it was very clever the way it was done. But it ensured their power because it always had the power of the judges and the prosecutors to trump the parliament or actually prosecute people the way they wanted to. In the 2012 constitutional amendment election in Turkey, a lot of this changes. The amendments in 2012 were very important in changing, but at the time that Fethullah Gülen is on trial, this is still a process. So you still have this very rigid, military-controlled judicial system. In fact, at this time, you actually had Fethullah Gülen was actually on trial twice. I write about the second trial. After the 71 coup, they arrested thousands of people as a terrorist, and from the right to the left, in the middle, labor, whatever, anybody that was in opposition was arrested, and they were all tried in military courts, right, like we do in Guantanamo, the military courts. 3 military officers would do the trial. Well, you know how fair that's going to be. So in that first trial, Gülen is convicted, given 2 years of hard punishment, which is solitary. He goes up on appeal and is reversed, set aside as being too harsh, and then there's an amnesty. Every time there's a coup, everybody gets arrested, put in jail, convicted, and then there's an amnesty and release. This is pattern in Turkey. So this happened to him in 71. When he gets in 2000, when he's getting indicted again, now maybe I should get to the wild card. Let's do the wild card. The wild card is Turkey tries to join the European Union. The European Union says, look, Turkey, before we even consider you coming into the Union, you've got to do some things. A lot of other things, but in terms of human rights, you've got to get rid of the military courts. You can't have military courts anymore. This is crazy. And you have to start changing your laws to protect civil liberties. So Turkey begins. They do abolish military courts, and then they create state security courts. So instead of having 3 military judges, they have 1 military judge and 2 civilians. But they drive the civilians home every night. And the civilian judges have to go to special classes every Saturday morning. So even though 2 of the 3 are no longer military, they're getting the message. So when Gülen is indicted in 2000, he's indicted into the state security courts. Now the year before he's left Turkey, he's gone to the Mayo Clinic in the United States. As you probably know, his health is very bad. It's always been very bad, historically. But anyway, the year before the indictment in 1999, comes to the Mayo Clinic, and he decides to stay in the United States. And that's another trial I'll get to at the end, what happened in the United States courts. But they still go ahead and indict him. And then the question is whether they're going to bring him back for trial or not. And the judge says, no, we'll do it in absentia. But it's in the state security courts. Okay? So nothing happens for a little bit. And then the indictment is 80 pages, and it has all kinds of stuff. It says that he is a secret follower of Reverend Mooney, secret agent of China, secret agent of the CIA, secret agent of Iran, secret agent of Iraq, so on and so forth. Or he was up in the mountains treating the Kurds, the terrorists. But my favorite, since I'm a Catholic, is that he's a secret cardinal of the Pope. Now, if you're Catholic, you know there's no chance on earth that you're going to have a Muslim who's a secret cardinal. In fact, you probably didn't see him vote. Gülen did not vote for Pope Francis. You didn't see that happen, right? But here's the thing. This is the thing about it. You know, it seems kind of stupid to me, but if you tell that to somebody, a Muslim in Turkey, that is going to really upset a lot of Muslims, that he might actually be a secret cardinal, or that he's part of the Israeli secret police, or that he's part of Iraq. To tell Iran, to tell us, the United States, that he's aligned with Iran would freak us out, because we would then see a theocracy coming, right? The way the clergy controls the country of Iran. So all the charges, even though they don't make sense when you put them together, are charges that play to different audiences. That was the same way with the media campaign, playing to different audiences. In fact, after I wrote my book, there's another book that has come out actually analyzing all of the media, what was going on in the media, you know, and showing the different audiences and all that. And then I was looking at the chart the author did, and you can see during the parts of the trial, every time there's something going on in the trial, the media spikes, jumps dramatically. All right, so Gülen is indicted, and by this guy named Yüksel, into the State Security Court. And then because of the European Union, what happens next is that Turkey abolishes state security courts. So then Gülen is transferred over to the civil courts. Then the parliament passes an amnesty. It says, we'll forgive you if you behave. Gülen was charged with 10 years solitary confinement or hard labor. And the indictment was also against all of his or institutions related to the movement. So if you look at the indictment, this is 71 indictment too. But if you look at the indictment, it says Gülen, this indictment is against him and against all entities related to him. This is the reason that I mentioned earlier why there is no corporate structure in the movement in Turkey. Because historically the government's tried to get assets that are related to people who are doing things the government disagrees with. So there's a legal reason in Turkey not to have corporate relationship. And the way Turkish law worked then is that even if you were acquitted, the government could still seize your assets. Now that sounds like a violation of due process, but we have the same thing in the United States. If you're stopped and you're carrying marijuana, for example, your son might have put there, and you're not guilty of the crime, our government can still seize your car. So it's the same thing. I mean, it sounds a little weird when you hear it, but it is something that governments do. So that's another reason not to have corporate connections. So everybody's separate, right? People doing the school in Africa are separate from the people doing the school in the Kurdish area, the people doing the school in Pakistan or whatever. Or any of the enterprises that go on are kept separate, but the indictment's there. So that's what they try to do, and you have all these, and then there's some fabricated video shots spliced together. And you can tell just by watching them that they're spliced. You know, they're trying to get Gülen to say things. You know, they take different snippets of his speeches and put it together. There are a couple of those videotapes that were played on TV, also as part of the defamation campaign. One of the TV stations has since apologized for having done that. So all of this is going on. The trial goes on. Gülen says, I'm not going to, oh, I forgot where I diverted here, is that under the amnesty you can say, okay, I'll be good for 10 years, because I wanted 10 years solitary. And then at the end of 10 years, then they dismiss the case against him. And Gülen says, no, I'm not going to do that. I want the trial. I want the trial because this has hurt the movement. It undercuts our work. People don't know what's going on. I want the truth out there. The prosecutor, Yüksel, says, we want Gülen in jail. We want the trial. And the judges say, tough luck. We're going to postpone it. No trial for a while. Then the wild card again. European Union says, Turkey, you've got to change the definition of terrorism. It has to include a violent act or a crime. You can't just prosecute somebody because of their political beliefs. If it's going to be terrorism, you've got to include violence as part of that. Under Turkish law, so Turkey's changed the law. Turkey changed the law. They had to change it. Part of the bargain with the European Union. But under Turkish law, if the crime changes while you're in trial, and it's to your advantage, then the new charge is what applies. So the new charge that applied to Gülen then, terrorists doing a violent act. And of course there was absolutely nothing at all to show that Fethullah Gülen ever did anything violent. There's nothing. So what happened is that his lawyers, had great lawyers, they filed a 146-page brief attacking all of these charges and said, we want acquittal, find him not guilty. The judges then sent a notice around all the police in Turkey and said, is there anything, any of you know, that anybody associated with the movement or Fethullah Gülen has ever done anything violent or committed any crime? And of course, everything came back negative. Nothing, 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 nothing. So in 2006, the judges, the three judges, fined Fethullah Gülen not guilty. Acquitted him, 2006. This is pretty significant if you look at the dynamic. First of all, the judges wrote an opinion in which they went through every one of the charges and said, not true, not true, not true, not true. They went through every one of the charges. So everything I've told you, all these charges and many more, the judges said not true. They also said the video was spliced. They did all of that. And what's significant about this is that these judges knew they were risking their careers. And in Turkey, when the judges retire to talk about how they're going to rule, the prosecutor goes back with them. Can you imagine? So here you are on trial, and the guy who's against you goes back and meets with the judges. You don't get to go. I don't think, to me that's not very fair. But the thing is, it also sends a message to the judges. This is what we want you to do. Nevertheless, the judges found him not guilty. And none of the judges have ever been promoted since then, either. They knew they were affecting their career, and they still went ahead and did the right thing. This prosecutor then decides to appeal. And it goes up to the Court of Appeals. And 5 judges are assigned to hear the case. 2 years later, 2008, in May, they rule not guilty. They said the trial court was right, not guilty. Then the state goes up to the full Court of Appeals, which is 23 judges, called the Supreme Court, 23 judges. And amazingly, they ruled in 2 months. It took them 2 years to rule the first time, but the next time, all 23 of them, in 2 months, 17-6 vote not guilty, affirmed the trial court. So Gülen wins in 2008. Very significant victory for democracy in Turkey, and shows the interrelationship, how the dynamic goes back and forth, how the European Union actually helped this process, but also the trial helped strengthen democracy in Turkey. And in fact, it was a good summer for Fethullah Gülen, because he was also named one of the top 20 intellectuals in the nation, in the world, by the U.S. Foreign Policy magazine in British Prospect. His name, almost at the same time the trial was coming out. And you might have seen that he was named by Time magazine last week as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. But not only were there 2 victories that summer, there were 3. And this one was from the United States courts. So Fethullah Gülen, when he goes to the United States for medical treatment, wants to stay in the U.S. So he applies for a religious scholar visa and gets it. He gets this religious scholar visa that says you can stay in the U.S. as long as you're doing religious stuff. And he was writing, he's written something like 70 books, and writing all kinds of articles in the Fountain and preaching and recording, and holding seminars at the place in Pennsylvania and all that. And so he has religious scholar status. But when the trial starts in 2006, all of a sudden the United States government decides it's going to revoke his religious scholar status and send him back to Turkey, saying that he was not a religious scholar, after they had certified for years that he had been. So Gülen actually ends up again with a very good lawyer. And they managed to get into the United States courts. Usually on an immigration case, you cannot get into court. But he got into court, and the judge was very fair. The United States sent, this was going on in Philadelphia, the trial. The lawyer for the U.S. government came from Washington. So there was something going on up high in our government to get rid of his status. So the judge says, look, I don't understand what's going on. How can you say he's a religious scholar and all of a sudden say he's not? And the judge said, isn't this the kind of Muslim you want in the United States? Somebody talking about nonviolence, who's moderate, who's totally devoted to religious belief. Is this what we want in the United States? And the judge said, and not only that, but he meets with all these Christians, he meets with the Jews. Look at that picture of him with the Pope. Now, if you've seen the picture with the Pope, you know there are lots of them with John Paul II, and their videos. Do you know what our lawyer, the United States lawyer, told the judge? Your Honor, those are photoshopped, made up. That's, so I was criticizing Turkey, the legal system in Turkey, but look what our lawyers were doing. And the judge got really mad and said, whoever is making the decisions for the United States government, I want in my court in the morning. And usually when the judge says that, the lawyers get really freaked out and become very much afraid, because it's not going to be a pleasant morning. The lawyer said, Your Honor, the person making these decisions in our government is so high up, I cannot get him here. So high up in this context probably meant, most people think, either the Secretary of Defense, which was Rumsfeld at the time, or Vice President Cheney. And it would be very easy for some of the Turkish military. Turkey buys billions of dollars in armaments from us, from the United States. It would be very easy to call up and say, we'd like a favor. Send this guy back to Turkey. Very easy to do. Anyway, the judge just said, nonsense, I'm not going to do it. Recertify him. Give him back his visa as a religious scholar. That happened the same time he was acquitted in Turkey, the same time he's named as one of the top intellectuals in the world. So it was a good summer for Fethullah Gülen, but it was a good summer for Turkey. It was really a good summer for Turkey. And when I was writing the book, let me show you this quote I have from Noam Chomsky. There we go. When I was writing the book, I met a lot of people that had been persecuted, had gone into exile. I talked to a member of parliament shot 22 times and survived. People that really gave their life, a lot of people were killed. And Chomsky says this about those folks. I know of no other country where leading writers, artists, journalists, academics, and other intellectuals have compiled such an impressive record of bravery and integrity in condemning crimes of state and going beyond to engage in civil disobedience to try to bring oppression and violence to an end, facing and sometimes enduring severe repression, and then returning to the task. It is an honorable record, unique, in my knowledge, a record of which Turkey should be proud and one that should be a model for others. And I think that says a lot about what has gone on in Turkey the last 20 to 30 years. It says a lot about the contribution of Fethullah Gülen and the movement. And it says a lot about Turkey, that the people are really committed to this process of democratization, even at great risk and great suffering, and even death, that a lot of people have endured. The last quote before I end is, I played this from when Robert Kennedy was running for president of the United States, before he was assassinated. He went to University of Cape Town during the year of apartheid in South Africa and gave this really great talk that you quite often hear quoted in the United States, but one that I wanted to bring to you all because it summons us all to do what we need to do. The greatest danger in our time is timidity. Few are willing to brave the disapproval of their fellows, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of their society. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. Yet, moral courage is the one essential, vital quality of those who would change a world that yields most painfully to change. Those with the courage to enter the moral conflict will find themselves with companions in every corner of the world. Each time a person stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, that person sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. So not only is that what has happened, but that's the task that we all have, and the importance of the work that everybody does in our daily lives is standing up for injustice, setting out that ripple of hope that Kennedy talks about. Because if we are the moral courage, if we do have the moral courage that he talks about, then we will have companions in every part of the globe. I think that is our calling, and that's what I took away from the book. And those are my comments. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Harrington. And now, if there are some questions you would like to ask Mr. Harrington, now you have the chance to ask.
About this notion of terrorism, if I may, something, it is really almost unbelievable for me that such a major state like the Republic of Turkey would have such a law with such a term which is utterly meaningless, referring to the earlier definition of terrorism in that law. It means absolutely nothing if it relates just to expression of a certain opinion about a need to change the constitution. And I don't know what the discourses were in this time internationally, but it is ridiculous to have such a law with such a term. And you told us that it has been corrected.
Yes.
And again, I feel it is ridiculous that they continued the proceedings with the new precise definition, because everything was,
Right.
I mean, totally meaningless. They did accuse him because of political dissent. That was the reason. They knew that he did not commit any violent crimes, and they just used this law, which had that term terrorism. So when the definition is changed in the law, I mean, everything is just it is a waste of time
Yeah.
to continue, and it's a futile undertaking, which they should have known, and they just lost faith.
Right.
If you told us how desperately they tried to collect the information from all over the country
Yeah. And
about acts of violence, but I'm sure they are intelligent people, those judges and prosecutors, they should have known.
well, you know, I think that's a very good point that you make. You know, it shows sort of the arrogance that they had, or the control they felt they had over the system, that could still prosecute him, even though the law had changed. Most countries, if the laws changed, would dismiss the charges, start over. You know, if they need to. Yeah, that's a good point, though. I mean, that's where they were, you know, their arrogance about this whole thing. And the message was very clear, you know, we need to put them away.
And do you know those judges, if I may ask? You told us that they were never promoted.
Right.
Is that unusual?
Yes.
For people of judges of that standing?
Yes.
Would they have been promoted?
Yes.
Under the Turkish system?
They would have, yes, most definitely, yeah. And there's some other things, you know, when I interviewed a lot of people, I interviewed prosecutors in the system. I interviewed 2 prosecutors, both of them have been in Turkey, and in the Kurdish area. One was civilian prosecutor, one was military prosecutor. They both had opened investigations of the military for torture, and they were both transferred across the country. The one from the civilian was sent to Istanbul to basically do traffic tickets, demoted, you know, and so he quit. And then the military judge, same thing, he just quit. He said, well, what's the point, you know? That was the kind of control. So it's not only would they give you the message, but they could effectively impact your livelihood, you know, just. But it's changing. I mean, the constitutional amendments of 2012 actually have a big impact on that council, which is good.
I wonder if you're sure about that, because he's a high-profile case, but there have been many students and, you know, people who are not so famous who are still being prosecuted under the terrorism laws, just simply for demonstrating. I've read last year, and the terror results, they're incarcerated for 8 months or something without process, without trial.
It's a continuing problem. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's not as bad as it was, but for sure. And it's not being prosecuted for terrorism, but there are restrictions still on speech. And there was going to be a demonstration in, I can't remember the name, the big plaza in Istanbul. Taksim. The other day on May 1st, and the government blocked it. And that's part of the criticism of Erdogan right now. And the movement that runs the Zaman newspaper has been extremely critical of Erdogan on these issues, you know. But that's still going on. I think one of the interesting things that happened in writing the book is I actually talked to young judges too. And I think there's a change going on. The European Union has actually invested a lot of money in training judges and prosecutors. Because, you know, the system in Turkey was basically very corrupt, the legal system. And I think a lot of the younger judges have greater understanding and responsibility and respect for civil liberties. And it's going to be interesting to see how much they push back against the government when this kind of stuff happens. I mean, there's no reason to block people from demonstrating. But that, you know, Erdogan gets, and you hear him sometimes, you know, he loses his temper with the press when they criticize him. So, he's got a...
I mean, there still seems to be many things like that. Fethullah was convicted.
But he insulted the general Turkish nation. He insulted the religious people. That was the reason for it.
Yeah, but see, now that's a good point you're making, because this is a very good point. In the United States, for example, in our idea of free speech, as long as it's not causing violence, you can't prosecute it, right? And no matter if they insult the president, insult the country, burn our flag, it's protected speech. That idea does not exist right now in Turkey, historically, and it doesn't exist in some other countries either, even in Europe. It does not exist. There's a limit on free speech. And I think part of the problem is educating the judges to understand it. And I'm not saying Turkey's perfect. No more than I'm going to say the United States is perfect either. And I think that is one of the areas in which it's very important for the judges to get a handle on this, and to push back on the prosecutions that are going on with respect to the press. I'm not saying either. I mean, a lot of the press was complicit in Ergenekon. There's no doubt about it, right? But there is also suppression on the part of the government. But to associate that with the movement, I don't think is proper, because I think the movement, well, first of all, the movement is not that organized, but also the paper and Zaman has been very, very, very critical of that happening. We'll see. I remember I talked to a young judge that had just come back from England, and going through the training. He had a hard time understanding that you can't, in the United States, you could insult the United States and not go to jail. I mean, he still had that in his mind. You could not insult the country. But we'll see. Progress. I want to make a point. At one time in our history, in World War I, you could prosecute people for exactly the same thing that Gülen was prosecuted for, right? Talking against the draft. In the United States, World War I is very unpopular because it was perceived as rich nations fighting with each other and bringing poor people in to be the soldiers. So where there was a lot of resistance, in fact, a lot of the people would escape to the United States because of oppression in their countries, Russians, for example. All of a sudden, when the army to go back, they said, what's this about? Why are we going to defend them? We're escaping from them. But we sent a lot of people to prison simply for disagreeing with government policy. That's now changed, but it took us 50 years to get that into our law to change.
I'm here to learn more about Turkey and what's going on there, but I keep looking to Texas Civil Rights Project, and I'm imagining you giving this talk in Texas and talking about the military-industrial complex and thinking about Halliburton and Dick Cheney, and if you want to comment about that right now, fine, but if you don't want to continue focusing on Turkey, it would fascinate me if you could weave in some more stories about your work with the Texas Civil Rights Project and how things look on the ground in Texas.
Well, we have a great website you can go to, look at all our work. We've got 5 offices and 40 staff. It's Texas Civil Rights Project, all one word, .org. We have plenty of work to do in Texas, plenty of human rights work to do in Texas. We could have 20 offices and we'd still be busy all the time. Rick Perry comes from Texas. You see the caliber of our leadership. George Bush came from Texas. We don't necessarily have a very good history. And that's what this is about in a sense, moral companions. I mean, we all around the world need to work on our own area to strengthen human rights because it helps everybody. I do a lot of work for people who have disabilities, right? And our law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in 1990, is a very good law. It's become a model for other countries. Other countries now use the same ideas. So whenever you do something in your own community, it really has that potential of impacting the whole world. And you have to do it here in Austria. I have to do it in Texas. People in Turkey have to do it because it furthers our whole progress towards human rights. So get to work. Just kidding. I'm sure you already do a good job. People probably want to go eat.
Yeah, my question is, what was the reason, the motivation that you wanted to write a book about Fethullah Gülen?
The reason
Yeah.
I wrote the book, even when I wrote the book, I still didn't know very much. I had to do a lot of research. When I came back to my first trip, I went on the interfaith trip. I came back and somebody says, why don't you write a book about the trial? I didn't know anything about the trial. I never knew he was on trial, even though it was the same year. He was acquitted the same year I went to Turkey. I had no idea. So I said, no, I'm too busy. I can't do it. So then I came back and I learned never go to lunch with Turks because they'll talk you into everything. So the next month they come back again and say, why don't you write the book? By then I thought about it. You know, I love human rights law. I don't get a chance to do very much at all because I'm in Texas. So I was intrigued by that, and intrigued by the fact that he actually won the trial, and that it helped strengthen democracy in Turkey. So I said, all right, I'll write it. So I wrote it. It was just, what can I say? I just happened to be in church the right day for, you know. Nothing dramatic. But it's a good example of how things happen to you in your life, you know, and it gives you the opportunity to do something with what happens.
My second question is, from which perspective is Fethullah Gülen for you important?
How do you mean?
From which standpoint is it important for you?
Yeah, what makes important for you? What is which personality is important? From which perspective?
I think it's democracy.
Yeah, I mean, let me answer there, and then you can tell me whether I understand your question. I think that, to me, this is a leader in a movement in the world that is trying to make the world a better place, to strengthen and enhance democracy, civil society. I think that we have to recognize in the world that we in the West, in the United States, that the Islamic community is about as big as the Christian community in the world, and that we need to be working together, and that there's a commonality in our respect for each other and for justice and for spirituality. I didn't know anything about the movement, but I think having now learned about the movement, and I think understanding Sufi mysticism has been very helpful for me as a Christian to understand and get a better sense of spirituality. And I just read something today, actually in the fountain on the way over on the train, about that very point. So I think that's important to me, you know, and I think dialogue is important. I don't think dialogue has to be limited to people who are believers. I mean, there are a lot of people who are very decent humanists. Albert Schweitzer was the doctor in Africa, you know, just did enormous good work. But I think the whole idea of supporting each other, people doing good stuff, is very important to do. It strengthens the cause, human rights, just generally.
Can I ask you a question? Can you help me to translate? Wir hören sehr viel so über die Medien, dass Gülen ist ein Projekt von der USA für die neue mit Nahost. Und Sie sind auch ein amerikanischer Professor und kriegen Sie auch so Kritik nach diesem Buch? Und finden Sie auch diese Kritik so recht oder nicht?
He says that in the United States there's a lot in the media about the Middle East and
In Turkey.
In Turkey, and that he's asking if you have received criticisms after writing the book about it or because of it.
Where we heard a lot, so that the Gülen movement is a project of the USA in the Middle East, so for the new big Middle East project. And you are an American professor.
Well, the criticism generally that you hear in the United States is raising the secular issue that I mentioned. That's the thing that bothers us. But it's like, again, as I said, it's because we're using the word, I think, two different ways. But I think generally there's great respect for Turkey overall in the U.S. When the movement comes up, it's not, I mean, sometimes it's critical. Quite a bit of the time it's not. There was a story in the New York Times that came out about the Texas schools. They're called Harmony. Why is it that the Texas schools hire so many contractors who are Turkish? Why is it they have teachers who are Turkish? Even though most of the students are not, right? They're in poor communities, so they're basically Hispanic kids or African American. But the thing is that because of the dialogue, and that a lot of the politicians had been over to Turkey and had met everybody, you know, and gone to the schools and stuff, and knew about the schools in the U.S., that was the end. That was the end of the criticism. You know, 10 years earlier, if it would happen without dialogue, Texas would be all over the place, you know, because we'd be talking about Muslims, we'd be talking about Arabs, you know, we don't distinguish in Texas, or we would not have distinguished. So I think that dialogue is very important to do. Anytime there's a movement, every movement is going to receive substantial criticism because it's changing the status quo. It's always going to engender criticism, whether or not it's right or wrong. And sometimes it's right, and quite often it's wrong. It just depends. But I know a lot of people in the movement get very upset with the criticism, but I mean, it's part of the game.
The people who discuss and criticize the movement, and they don't discuss you say it so more times, the dialogue message of Gülen is very important. And they don't discuss about the ideas of the Gülen, and then they discuss about the political things and some others. Is it right for you? So they don't discuss the idea for a very important thinker, and we discuss about is it a political project of the US, or what kind of a movement is it? What is the targets of this movement? And I heard a little bit about the ideas and his philosophy.
Well, I hate to say this, but I think you give Americans too much credit about thinking, period. I think Americans do not do a lot of political thinking, and I do not think they do very good political thinking. It's not about even knowing about Fethullah Gülen, but it's about anything. It's just not very good. And part of that's because of our leadership. It's not very good on that point. You know, America sees the world in its own self-interest all of the time, and not the world for who the world is. So, I mean, I can get in a taxi cab in Mexico and have a better discussion about American policy than I can talking to an American in Texas. I regret to say. But that's the level of political discourse in the United States. So anything the movement can do to raise that level of discourse in the United States would be terrific. But it's not very good. I mean, you almost know that. Listen to the speeches that our leaders give. I mean, they're awful.